Hello, everyone, and welcome to Agulhas Current Affairs, a marine science podcast set in Southern Africa with me as one of your hosts, Dr. Jonas Kirsten of Geekoscopy Media, alongside
Dr. Nelson Miranda of Argonaut Science. And today we're talking about the most powerful organisms.
Yeah.
We thought it was humans, isn't it? Like we always think, the most powerful. No, we're not talking about humans in politics. We're talking about the really most powerful organisms in the natural world, in our beautiful blue planet.
They were there long before us, long before the Marvel superheroes, long before DC, almost at the dawn of life itself.
And they could actually do that thing that Thanos does, if they only had thumbs. They don't even need thumbs.
Yeah.
But I mean, what do we think about when we think about these powerful, most powerful organism? I think in our minds, a lot of the time, images of big things come, isn't it?
Yeah. Like you think of things that are like the biggest in the water, or the biggest on land, or like the fastest, or like so that kind of thing. Like you think of like maybe blue whale or like an elephant.
Yeah, or a whale shark. Like
a whale shark. Yeah,
biggest fish. Whale shark.
Yeah, always the biggest, like singular thing that can be big.
It's natural for us to think, like that because we are also big things. We're animals. We're big, and then it's natural to think about other animals like us.
Yeah, for sure, 100%. So, like, we're going to identify with other things that are like close to us on a conceptual level, like walking around like our size, like around that area. But animals and plants and organisms happen, or they occur all the way from things that you can't see, right?
Yeah,
all the way to those big things. And it's oftentimes those small things that are kind of embedded in the environment in a fundamental nature, and they determine how the environment looks to begin with for us and these other big, more charismatic megafauna, we like to call them in science, actually determines the environment that they're going to live in, and whether it's going to be comfortable or really difficult.
Yeah, and I mean, we also connect with the bigger things on an emotional level. I've seen a lot of kids holding on, kids and adults. I mean, we don't discriminate actually, because we hold on to plushies, like teddy bears and things of that sort. And I've seen, big things like whale sharks, whales, dolphins, turtles is a popular one, and less. So sometimes I see a jellyfish or a crab, which is quite interesting. Now we're getting a bit smaller, like invertebrates, which is cool. Snails and things like that. But I don't really see a lot of plankton being held. Maybe there's some exceptions for sure. But like single-celled microscopic organisms that have been blown up into like this plushie that you can hold and connect on an emotional level with. Those are less common, I think.
Yeah, the thing is you can't see them. So like if your natural eyes can't see them, you don't have any way to like kind of understand or identify with. But like we said earlier, very important. For functioning.
Just because we can't see them, that doesn't mean they're not around us. They are. They're all around us. They're inside of us. They're everywhere, and they are, working all the time to make the world what it is, for us to be able to live in it in the way it is. We can see them if you have a microscope, and sometimes you can see them because they're very small, but there are many of them. And then when they get together, from a distance, you can actually see a big difference. And that's the point, that, even though they're small and, invisible individual organisms, together their numbers are huge, and together they make a huge difference. They literally build the world, around us. And that's why you should care about what you can't see,
Yeah, for sure.
We care about things we can't see all the time. We care about oxygen, for example. That's something we can't see.
Yeah, I
and
mean, we
it's
can't see
small.
oxygen, we can't see we can't see Wi-Fi, but
We
we
can't
need
see
it to like
Wi-Fi, but we definitely
we
can.
definitely need it. Yeah.
That's a very good point. And I mean, plankton. So we're talking about plankton. That's
Mm.
what it is that we're talking about. And what is plankton? Because I think one of the most well-known plankton in the you know in the social media is probably the plankton from SpongeBob SquarePants. Is that right?
Oh yeah, yeah. Plankton from the
Yeah,
chum bucket. Yeah,
the
100%.
chum bucket plankton. I'm
Yeah,
telling you, it's actually made strides into introducing these invisible
the
organisms.
idea. Yeah,
Yeah,
plankton. Yeah, when you put it that way.
plankton is
Um,
there. Yeah,
but on the other hand, like jellyfish are technically plankton, or some of them,
that's right.
because they float around. And the idea of plankton just means that it has very limited control of whether it can how it moves. You know,
Hmm.
so like I think about it like the word plank. If you just like take a wooden plank and throw it on the pool, it just like floats around. Like that's where you get. No, that's how I think of
That's
plankton.
that's a good way to think to remember what about how the plankton. Huh.
Yeah, yeah. The other way, I mean, the opposite of that is nectin. So that's what we call things that actually actively swim. So like fish and like I suppose crabs or anything else that has
Yeah,
an idea of moving through the water column. We call that nectin. Other things
yeah,
are plankton, and there's some things that kind of straddle in between. That's kind of like mixed.
yeah,
But because
yeah.
they're
But
kind of
basically,
such a small like size frame, they're basically just moving with the current.
yeah. If there's a little bit of a current, they can't really fight against it. I think the biggest
Mm.
movement. I think we're going to talk about one of the biggest movements on Earth. Uh, you know, uh, that involves plankton in another episode. So stay tuned for that because that's
Yeah,
also a cool
yeah.
episode that we're gonna have on the works. But they're not able to fight the currents of the ocean, so they'll be in the ocean. They're at the mercy of, the movements of the water, essentially, and that's what plankton is. And this plankton is actually, we already said there's many of it. It's usually small, and it's important because it's the basis. It forms the basis of everything. Like it's the food for everything. So there's small things that can be fed upon by other small things that's slightly bigger, and that thing is fed by slightly even bigger things, and then all the way up to the charismatic megafauna. So you can see how it's the base that supports the bigger charismatic
Yeah,
animals.
for sure. And we refer to that as like primary and secondary producers, right? They're right at the bottom of the food chain, which is actually more of a web because
Yeah,
things
it's a
like
web.
interconnect. So they are taking things that are like non-living out of the water column and then creating living material on it. So yeah, they
Yeah,
go from zero to hero just like
the,
that.
the literal basis of life itself. The fuel
Yeah.
of life itself. And and we're gonna first talk about this because there's many different kinds of plankton. We already mentioned that they can actually vary in
Mm.
size. But there's different kinds, and today we're going to start by talking about phytoplankton. Phyto meaning plant-like, you know. So it's a prefix that you can, for fun, add to a word, and then it'll become about plants.
For sure, for sure. So phytoplanktons are going to be those kind of plankton that are able to, like plants, pull energy from non-living nutrients and then and energy from the sun and kind of like
Yeah,
put that together and turn it into like stuff that other things can actually eat, including themselves. That's why they're doing it. And it's in the form of like simple sugars, and they use that to create energy and so on and so forth.
yeah, it's so cool because they're solar powered.
Yeah.
They're solar powered, and then they do this cool thing that every school going child might have heard of. You probably heard of this photosynthesis, isn't it?
Oh
Photo
yeah.
meaning light,
Yeah.
like a
Yeah.
photon, and synthesis meaning to build, to put together, synthesize,
Yeah.
to like
To
uh,
create. Yeah.
to create. Yeah, that's right. And of course, they take it's like magic, isn't it? They take things that are non-living, and particularly they take carbon dioxide, which is kind of important, isn't it? To think about. Carbon dioxide is an important gas. Oxygen is an important gas as well. Those two gases are quite important to us as human beings. And they take carbon dioxide and they do their magic, and out comes as a byproduct for free oxygen.
Yeah, for free. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, so they take a gas that by most counts, I think in recent memory in the media, is bad because it is a greenhouse gas that causes heat to increase in the atmosphere, and they pull the carbon out of that, create sugars with that, and what they get left over is the oxygen. And with that, it allowed us to be a thing. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to. Also, like they also needed to respire when the sun is not shining, because when the sun's not shining, they're not producing stuff. So it then goes in reverse. Then now they take up the oxygen, they break the sugars apart. That goes back into CO2, and they respire. When they're not well, it's probably happening when they're producing it well, but obviously when the sun is not there, then they're producing a lot of CO2. And I don't know if this is like a housewife's myth, but like that's why they say like you shouldn't have too much house plants, because at night they might suffocate you.
They compete with you.
Yeah.
During the day everything's great, but at night.
At night, yeah.
But there's this idea that plants, and definitely plants are important. They do produce a lot of oxygen for us. But really, really, really a major part of the oxygen that we breathe every day actually comes from the ocean, from these phytoplankton. That's the byproduct. So those phytoplankton, they floating in, the plankton, the small things floating in the ocean, at the mercy of the ocean. They're taking the dissolved carbon dioxide that is floating in the ocean, they're taking the sunlight, and they're doing their magic of photosynthesis, and off comes oxygen, which then is released into the atmosphere. And the carbon dioxide is coming from the atmosphere as well, isn't it? It's being mixed from the atmosphere. So they're really doing us a huge favor, as big things, as big organisms, isn't it?
Something like for something that you can't see, it's responsible for about 50% of the photosynthesis that's going on in the world, which is surprising.
Yeah.
Given that you can't like actually see it.
Yeah, like, and I mean 50% is an estimate, it might be more. And if you think about this history of the Earth, if you look at the ancient history of life on the Earth, they were there before the plants. Sorry, but that's just a fact.
Yeah.
They were the first original photosynthesizers,
Yeah. Plants just get owned on this podcast. It's just like, okay, sharks were there first, and algae were there first. I mean, we're zoologists, okay, so maybe we're biased.
Yeah. Please take it with a lot of salt from the ocean.
Yeah, plenty. 35 parts per thousand.
Yeah, to be precise. On average. So yeah, that was a salty joke. Moving on. So the bottom line is: do you like to breathe? Do you like to breathe? Do you?
Me, yeah.
Yeah. So you do it every day. Is this a habit?
Every day that I'm alive, yeah.
Yeah. So if you do, then every second breath, at least, there should be a breath of gratitude for these organisms that we can't see. And I mean, we can go smaller, hey. And by the way, we can also talk in the future thing. We can talk about those that are away from the sun and what do they do. Because there's photosynthesis and then there's, spoiler alert, chemosynthesis. So, but we'll talk about. We'll talk about that in a future.
That needs its own episode for sure.
Oh yeah, because that's really interesting stuff. But that you can get even smaller, isn't it? Because so there's phytoplankton, but you can go even smaller. You can say bacterioplankton. So we've heard of bacteria before as being very small things, and you can even go smaller than that and talk about viruses and viral plankton. Yeah, and again, for things that you can't see, you get smaller, but you get more of them, so they are more abundant. And the bacteria are super important as decomposers, and to recycle all of those basic components of organic life, all the nutrients that are needed, you know, to help that growth. So we're talking about the organisms are so powerful that they are contributing to the growth of everything on Earth. Most things on Earth. And then, of course, the even smaller things, like the phytoplankton, they're even more abundant than the most abundant organism, technically, on our planet. And they, of course, infect bacterial plankton, kill, so they're the biggest killers. And all of these have big roles to play in the natural balance or the foundations. Let's think about it like a home, isn't it? Like a house. These are the foundations of our home, right? And we can have a home that is very comfortable to live in, and we like that, and we do a lot of things as human beings to try and maintain that. We also do a lot of things that go against it, so we try to be a bit smarter. So we hopefully contribute to a home that we can all live in as human beings. But sometimes the foundations can change, and if you have different sort of balance of these organisms, those foundations can be quite unpleasant indeed, isn't it?
For sure, 100%. And just to throw some jargon at you, for what Nelson just mentioned, if you thinking about bacterial plankton, especially the ones that photosynthesize, you might come across the word cyanobacteria or also blue-green algae. So if you hear those terms, that's what that's referring to. And viruses that kind of predate, they're more like infecting, like bacteria. We call this bacteriophages. So if you hear those words, viruses in general are not a good thing. Have you heard of beneficial viruses?
Viruses can be a good thing, actually, because they've always been part of life, and they fiddle with DNA, with the code of life itself. So check out other of our podcasts where we talk about DNA. But viruses are super important. Part of our DNA is viral in nature as well. So viruses integrate and use DNA. They are intertwined with the evolution, the history of life. And there's actually this movement, because you see, as human beings, for example, we've worried about bacteria a lot. Germs. We got a little bit obsessed about germs, so we started focusing on them as we need to fight these germs. And then in the process, we've just created conditions where the bacteria become stronger and they become superbugs. And it might be the only way forward, that we actually look smaller and think smaller and work with more powerful, smaller things to try and solve that problem of the superbug. Because indeed, the bacteriophages are the greatest killers on Earth, and they could actually solve that problem for us. They don't interact so well with, because there's different scales of size. It's very difficult for the virus to directly, most viruses, because remember, we're talking about viruses as like all viruses, and there's so many of them. Obviously, we know the very, relevant ones that cause disease for us, but those are it's laughable. It's a laughable small percentage of all viruses on Earth. So most viruses on Earth would actually be working and are working in our favor. And we could actually, on purpose, have them work in our favor to control superbugs. So that could be a thing for the future. It might be the only way for us to cope with this problem that we created of the superbugs.
For sure. And there's other things to mention about viruses, but I think we could also do a separate episode, a deep dive about viruses. In a marine science context. But thinking about stuff that's harmful, it's not only viruses that can be harmful. The algae themselves can also be harmful. It's not all blue skies. It's not all green meadows.
Sometimes they are red. They are very red.
Sometimes they are red like blood.
Exactly.
And it can be terrible for you and everything around it.
Yeah. So, of course, we're talking about red tides. When you look into the ocean, instead of the usual bluish sort of colors, suddenly you see the oceans turn red, So what's happening there? It's what we like to call a bloom, it's a beautiful flowery bloom. So it's an algal bloom in this case, you know. And the thing about that is that, so obviously that means one particular group of organisms has now suddenly gotten, an advantage, and now they've reproduced and they've taken over. So that's the most abundant, and that's when we then obviously notice them, because we can see them at a very large scale as the water turning that color, right? But if we took a drop of water, we could see there's thousands upon thousands of these organisms in a drop, isn't it? But anyway, so these are red tides, and the thing about that is that suddenly there's all this life, right? And it's definitely not something that's very sustainable, because all these things, they need to breathe, at some stage, and they need to eat, and they will run out of resources eventually, because they'll take up all the resources to fuel their growth and this bloom, and then they die, right? And then there's a bit of a problem, because then the bacteria will come in and start decomposing, and the bacteria will consume oxygen, and then suddenly you have very little oxygen available in the water. And this creates, by that stage, what we call a dead zone. It's dead for those of us organisms that like oxygen.
Yeah.
There are other organisms that's perfect for them. But for most of us multicellular, organisms, not so good.
Yeah. If you're a respiring organism, respires normally.
Yeah.
Having what we call technically a hypoxic conditions is not good for anybody.
Yeah. Low oxygen is hypoxic. And then this was when you see around the Cape as well, you'll see the multicellular organisms straight up walk out of the ocean, because they can't even, this is the
you just can't.
The crayfish, they will literally walk out into the beach away from this low oxygen zone.
For sure, it's not a good thing. So I mean, it's you're lucky, like, if you can move away. Not everything can move away from the stuff, so it does still end up with sometimes a lot of things being killed, mass fish kills in estuaries. So if you're stuck in an area and the oxygen goes, generally you can expect that most things will die in that place if they need that.
It
oxygen.
can happen. But then, there's another danger as well, because if the community of these tides happens to be something composed of a very particular type of algae called the dinoflagellate, right? And I like to call them the cells from hell. Cell from hell. These
cells.
Yeah, these little critters, they are quite hardcore, and they produce all sorts of different kinds of poison, right? And the effects on the bigger animals can vary from a little bit of an irritation on the skin to if you eat something that's been eating and survived or maybe died. Like, so say if you say I have a fish kill, this is why we shouldn't eat those fish that are, washed to the shore, because they could have died because they have a high, they have a lot of these dinoflagellates inside of them. They've consumed them, or dinoflagellates have attacked them and entered their body, right?
It's toxic,
and they produce these poisons, and they are toxic. And so if you eat that, then you could have, an upset stomach, or it can be so toxic that whatever killed the fish could kill you as well. Which is why you should pay very close attention if there's a fish kill. Don't just eat, whatever washes up.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that causes shellfish poisoning as well, because whatever animals that kind of filter a lot of the stuff in, which is what mussels and oysters and stuff kind of do, they tend to accumulate nasty stuff. So it could be either those toxins, or it could be stuff like heavy metals as well.
It could be other things as well, for sure. So that's definitely the thing about shellfish, mollusks.
So if you see a red tide or anything else like that, do not be eating no mussels or oysters.
Yeah, that's probably not a good idea, just to be safe, of course. But these red tides, I know that they are becoming more apparent, more common, and sometimes there's spots where they just persist, isn't it? You see one there in your neck of the ocean. the neck of the ocean.
Well, no longer. Now we are on either side of Oberga, otherwise previously known as Port Elizabeth.
Yeah.
But yeah, there is a persistent like bloom that happens in Algoa Bay, the bay there, that comes around almost every like summer. Every time it gets hot, the conditions are like ripe enough for these algae to kind of bloom out. And yeah, it kind of takes over. But I don't think it's like super dangerous, but it's obviously something that is being caused by unnatural means. It's a lot of nutrients that's being pumped from human settlements, because we dump a lot of the stuff that we don't need into the rivers. And a lot of that is a lot of nutrient-full wastes, like nitrates and phosphates that either come from like fertilizer or other unmentionable, unmentionable things as well.
Unmentionable. Okay, we shall not mention it then. We shall not speak of it right now. But yeah,
raw sewage. Okay.
Okay, fine. You said it. Fine.
Yes.
There, we said it.
Which is nutrients, right?
It's nutrients. Yeah. I mean, it's great stuff for the base to fertilize the base of these of life. But you might not like some of the specific organisms that are favored by this. They might not be great, or sometimes they are. Sometimes it's depending on the composition, and it's many factors that determine which organism rises to the top and blooms. But some of these organisms are actually beautiful to see because they bioluminesce, isn't it? So sometimes people love it. Here in False Bay, we have blooms as well, and they can be composed of harmful organisms, but sometimes it's mostly just fairly not harmful, and sometimes it's a lot of bioluminescent organisms, and people love to see the bioluminescence at night as the waves break. It's like a light show. Nature's a big light show. So that's kind of cool.
Noctiluca plankton.
Yeah, Noctiluca.
So really cool to see, because it like glows when you like agitate it. So like
that's right. It's almost like it's a defensive mechanism, and also like I think communication. We will talk about it in another podcast if you're interested, because there's a lot of things that glow in the ocean, particularly in the deeper, darker places on this planet, and. Very interesting to talk about that, because it's the language of life. The first language is probably one of the first languages, if not the first language, involves light, which is kind of very cool. If you think about it a little bit deeper. And then of course the other thing that also influences, so we have high nutrients and then warm waters as well. So the warmer the water, the more growth, so that's nice warm and high nutrients are conditions, and that tends to be favorable to these big blooms of phytoplankton. And as we know, there's more of this happening. There's generally more of these events. The waters are getting warmer. We're getting extreme events.
Are you saying that the globe is getting warmer, Nelson?
I'm saying that there are more extreme events, marine thermal events, which is something that we've spoken about as well.
Yes, in a previous episode.
So
it's not released yet, but will be released, because I swapped the climate change
I saw that
episode. Yeah,
coming soon. We're gonna get extreme.
exactly. But yeah, like it's climate change, right? So it's longer periods of dry spells, low rain, and then high temperatures, also higher baseline medium temperatures increasing over time, and that allows for warmer water for plankton, especially harmful plankton, to proliferate. And so the chance of harmful algal blooms is actually increasing. Also because we release more nutrients into the oceans via the rivers, so it's kind of like a two-punch, like shooting ourselves in the foot when it comes to algal blooms.
We also forget the freshwater habitats as well, because they also include all of these algae, right? Not the same species. I mean, there's freshwater, variants, and then there's estuarine variants, where there's a mixture between freshwater and the ocean. And then there's variants. I mean, obviously in the ocean there's a lot of variation of species.
It is a big thing in estuaries, because The thing with like freshwater and marine water is that they have different nutrient like profiles, right? So some of them might be limiting in some nutrients, and others will be limiting in different nutrients. So like when they meet, like a lot of nutrients come together. So that's why like you tend to have these big blooms
Yeah.
of things when
Yeah.
those two waters meet. Which is cool from a biological standpoint, but it can be terrible when you have harmful things in the water also blooming
Yeah,
around.
it's it's like, you have a lot of nitrogen but not so much phosphorus, and then
Yeah, yeah,
and then suddenly you have a lot of phosphorus but not so much nitrogen, and then you mix it all together, and suddenly whoever develops first and quickly harnesses those nutrients can come out on top literally. Then you can actually see a big color change in the water. Um,
yeah.
we'll talk about diatoms and zooplankton, and because these are all the very small organisms that are actually super powerful, and we should definitely be talking more about. So I think also let us know if this is of interest to you, who our listeners, and we'll definitely talk more about that. I think we should definitely talk about it.
For sure, 100%. We'll definitely be trying and see primary and secondary producers like the zooplankton, how important they are to the overall functioning of life, and probably in the next episode.
Yeah, I really think, we already mentioned this. They're the unsung heroes, isn't it? Mostly. And there's really cool memes about this. So we'll make maybe that meme as a thing as well, where we pay attention to the big charismatic things, and we kind of forget about the really hardworking,
Yeah.
humble
Guys
and
are
quiet.
putting in the work,
in the
for
background.
Sure. Yeah, but you can stay tuned to that, and if you want to chat to us about anything on this podcast, or let us know what you would like us to talk about, you can do so at Agulhas Current on Twitter, at Agulhas Current Affairs on other social medias. You can find me personally if you need to shout at me for any reason at Geekoscopy on Twitter and everywhere else. So what about you, Nelson?
Yeah, and you can find me at Argonaut Science or at Nelsapod. That is everywhere in the social medias.
Everywhere. Take a message, put some respect on the phytoplankton.
Yeah,
because
for
they
sure.
deserve it. All right, cheers.
Cheers.